so much, Iris. And man, it makes all the difference in the world when you sing from your heart. Some of us, that's the only place we can sing from. It's 2014. This year it's not a presidential election year, but it's a consequential election year. Every 2 years, of course, congressional reps and the House of Representatives, we vote for them every 2 years. And so, though it's not a presidential year in terms of elections, it's a pretty consequential year. A lot of House and Senate races that are going to be up for grabs. And unfortunately, that means for us, as we inch closer to November, we're going to be hearing probably a lot more about politics than you ever wanted to hear. And you're going to be hearing a lot more ads than you ever wanted to hear. You're going to be seeing the commercials where they keep taking pot shots at each other. And you're going to be hearing the radio spots. You're going to be seeing ads in the newspaper and magazines. As if you don't get enough junk mail already, you're going to be getting junk mail from various candidates and political action committees. And we're going to be inundated with all this stuff. Odds are along the way, though, too, you're going to be receiving some of those robocalls. And you know how those work. A candidate will have some type of message, or a political action committee will have some type of message that they record, and then they just blast it out in a period of minutes to literally thousands of homes. And it's an automated recording. You pick up your phone and you hear it. And over the years, I don't know how many of those I have received, but there is one of them that stands out in my mind. It was back in 2008. And our phone rang, and I went to pick it up, and I said, "Hello," and this is the voice I hear. He said, "Hello, this is Stevie Wonder, and I just called to say I love you and to vote for my friend Barack Obama." All right, so I hear this message, and I've got a few questions. First of all, how did Stevie Wonder find my name in the phone book? Secondly, who helped him dial it? And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, does that really have any effect on anybody? I mean, whether it's Stevie Wonder or whoever it is that calls you, whether it's the candidate themselves, do these robocalls actually influence anybody? My initial instinct or response is, no, it has no effect. But the truth is that there are a lot of people that know a whole lot about elections and the whole voting process and what moves the vote in one way or another. People that are paid an awful lot of money to advise particular candidates and political action committees. And it seems, based on the fact that they spend so much money making all of these millions of calls, that it must have some type of effect. It must have some type of effect. Then again, that shouldn't really come as much of a surprise to any of us, because virtually everything has an effect, doesn't it? I mean, we learned from science that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Virtually everything that we encounter and experience, it has some effect, whether nominal or significant, on our lives. Money has an effect on us. The weather has an effect on us. Friends have an effect on us. Music has an effect. Encouragement and positive comments, those things have an effect on us. So do hurtful and curt words. Virtually everything has an effect on us. Now, there is one particular experience that each of us is going to face and deal with to a variety of different degrees that has potentially consequential and devastatingly consequential effects, not only on our lives, but on our walk with the Lord, or in our walk with the Lord, and that's discouragement. I mean, discouragement has a tremendous effect and has tremendous consequences in our lives and in our walk with God. You know, a number of weeks ago, we began this series of messages that I've called When the Fizz is Gone. And what we've been talking about is how, especially over a lengthy span of time, the longer you've known the Lord, it becomes very easy for things to get very dull, flat, lifeless, stale, where the zeal, the passion, the vitality seems to be gone. Well, and there's a variety of different things that contribute to that. And, as you hear that type of description, some of you still may be saying, Michael, that kind of still describes where I am. Things, I feel like, and I'm confident, I know the Lord, I've got to walk with Him, but flat describes it. It may very well be that you're experiencing that the staleness has shown up, and the freshness, the zeal, and the fizz has gone because of discouragement. The good news is this: if we can understand how discouragement works in our lives, we can recognize that cease to stop those effects and not only prevent the fizz from going, but getting it back and keeping it once we get it. So how exactly is it that discouragement works? We see the answer to that question today in 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19. First Kings chapter 19, we'll pick up with verse 1, where we're told that Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as one of them by tomorrow about this time." And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life. He went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came and sat down under a broom or juniper tree, and he prayed that he might die and said, "It is enough. Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." As he lay and slept under this tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came back the second time. He touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose, he ate, and he drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave. He spent the night in that place, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with a sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Elijah is discouraged. Elijah would say, right now, the fizz is gone. Vitality, passion, enthusiasm, all of that's gone. In fact, he's saying, "I'm ready to die." Well, we see him today effectively as a case study in how discouragement works, not only in his life, but in my life and in yours. So how is it that it works? Well, it does a few things. And the first is this: it will lead you to focus on the attention of others. It will lead you to focus on the attention of others. Now, for what we're reading to have much consequence, we need to think about the broader context. There's four principal characters in this particular passage that we've read. There's Ahab, there's Jezebel, there's Elijah, and there's God. Well, hopefully you know who God is, but let's think about the rest of the characters. Ahab is the king of Israel at this point, and Ahab is a lousy, rotten, awful man. He's a terrible king, and spiritually speaking, he is absolutely bankrupt. He has turned his back on God, and he is effectively a godless, awful king and an awful man. And as if he weren't bad enough, he is outdone in terms of wickedness by his wife, a woman whose name is synonymous with evil, a woman named Jezebel. Jezebel, among other things, is an idol worshiper. She in particular worships Baal. She has influenced Elijah to follow her lead, and not only he, but the nation of Israel, so that idol worship has become, and Baal worship specifically, has become widespread throughout Israel. Well, in response to this, God raises up a man to serve as a prophet, to be a mouthpiece, a spokesman for God among his people, and that man was Elijah. And so Elijah is led by God to go and have a conversation with Ahab. Because of his wickedness and the idol worshiping that's going on throughout the country, God tells Elijah to go tell Ahab it's not going to rain. There's going to be a drought that's going to begin. Not only will there not be any rain, it's going to be so dry that there won't be even any dew. And so he goes and he tells Ahab, until I say so, there's going to be no more rain, completely, absolutely dry, an utter, devastating drought. Well, that doesn't put you in good favor with the king. And so there's this tension that builds that finally leads to a climactic challenge, where you have Elijah on one side and Ahab and 450 prophets of Baal on the other. They meet on Mount Carmel, and they're going to get to the bottom of this. Who really is God? Is it the Lord or is it Baal? And the solution for this was to first take the life of a bull. And so they slaughtered a bull, they place it on the altar. And the prophets of Baal will go first, and then Elijah will get a chance. And they're each going to call out to their respective God, and whoever responds with fire, consuming the sacrifice, well, that'll be the one real God. Well, it's the prophets of Baal. They get to go first, and the altar's been prepared, the bull is laid across it, and they begin the process of praying and calling out to Baal. But nothing happens, so they need to up the ante a little bit more. And they begin to call out even more loudly, and they're beginning to weep and dance and moan and wail and do all sorts of things to convey to Baal the depth of their sincerity and their commitment to him. But that doesn't work. They even get to the point where they begin to cut themselves and bleeding everywhere, trying to demonstrate their commitment to this false god. And what happens? Nothing happens. That lifeless bull stays there on the altar. Well, they finally just give up, and it's Elijah's turn. Well, Elijah doesn't merely just call out to God. He does something first. And what he does is to have water pots, what became 12 of them, large water pots containing gallons and gallons of water. And they fill them, and then they soak this altar with water, so much that there's a trench around it where there's standing water in it. Well, you're aware that water and fire don't mix very well. And so it's made it all the more unlikely that a fire is going to consume anything on that altar. But then Elijah gets down and he calls out to the Lord. And God responds with this fire from heaven that not only consumes the sacrifice, it even laps up all the water that's in the trench. It's clear who the real God is. And on that day, Elijah then kills these 450 prophets. Well, that leads us to chapter 19. And as Elijah has now killed these prophets, he's also announced, based on what God has told him, the drought's over. Rain's coming back. God has demonstrated that he is, in fact, the one true God. In verse 1, we're told that Ahab, he goes and he tells Jezebel all that Elijah had done, how he had also executed all the prophets with a sword. Now, that verse doesn't tell us this, but when I read that verse, I do so with a voice in mind. And the voice is that of a little whiny child going to its mama. And then Elijah, and then he did this. And then you're not going to believe he did that. And on top of that, he did this. And just this whiny little voice, as if he's a little child going to mommy and saying, this is everything that Elijah has done. He did this, he did that, and you're not going to believe that he also did that. But let me ask you this. Who exactly was Elijah's beef with? Who caused the drought? Did Elijah cause the drought? No, he was just the one that announced it. Who consumed the sacrifice? Did Elijah do that? No, God did that. Elijah was just the prayer. Well, when it began to rain again, who caused that? Did Elijah cause that? No, he simply was the weather forecaster saying it's getting ready to start again. Who exactly was the beef with? The beef was with God. The problem that Ahab had was with God, but all of his ire, all of his angst, all of his anger is now directed towards Elijah. And this tirade by Ahab infuriates Jezebel, and she, I think, views her husband effectively as a little weakling. I just kind of picture him as a little tiny guy that she'd kind of put under her arm and carry around with him, and she decides, no, we're not going to tolerate that. Not under my watch. I'm the queen of Israel, and I'll not stand for such nonsense, for such insolence. And so she sends word to Elijah. You see it in verse 2. So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I don't make your life as the one of them, by these dead prophets by tomorrow. I mean, it's not simply a death threat. This is effectively a warrant for his execution. She's saying, by this time tomorrow, you're a dead man. Start counting them. You've got 24 hours. I hope that you enjoy them. So Ahab, his wife Jezebel, they are infuriated. They are enraged. They are zealous with fury against who? Against God? No, against Elijah. They issue this death threat, and now what does Elijah do? Well, he does what seems perfectly reasonable. He runs. He goes a day's journey into the wilderness, and we find him in verse 4. He's sitting under this juniper tree, and he's talking to God, and this is what he says: "It is enough. God, I have had it. Lord, now take my life." I know better than my fathers were. My life has now essentially resulted to nothing. Let's go ahead and get this over with. You go ahead and take me. Would you say that for Elijah the fizz is gone? Sure it is. Would you say beyond that Elijah is discouraged? Absolutely he's discouraged. And he is overrun with fear, with trepidation, with anxiety. He's ready to give up, ready to throw in the towel, ready to say it's through. My life and my ministry are over. But let me ask you this: what got him to that point? What leads him to this place? Well, it's not simply fear, it's discouragement. And in his discouragement, what is he doing? Is he focusing his gaze, his attention towards heaven? No. He's paying attention to who? Ahab and Jezebel. Discouragement will do that. It will lead you to focus on the attention of others. Listen, the truth is, regardless of how long you have known the Lord, the longer that you walk with Him, you're going to be having experiences with other people. And you're going to be, in your attempts in serving God and representing Him and accomplishing that which He's called you to do, you're going to be having other people, both in the church and outside the church, looking at you. And some are going to look at you, and they're going to do so through the lens of and through the glasses of positive feeling. And they're going to think and feel and respond positively and encouragingly to you. But there's going to be plenty of others, though, that aren't going to be looking at you and what you have done and what you're doing in such a positive light. They're going to be looking at you through the lens of criticism. And they're going to look at you, and regardless of what it is that you're doing, they're going to be naysayers and people that are beginning to throw stones. People that are saying, well, it wasn't that good. I don't know why you did that. What's the matter with you? And they'll sometimes begin to voice these behind your back. Sometimes it'll even come to the fore. Well, they'll aim their arrows directly at you. Sometimes they'll even attack your character and integrity and do so without cause. They may even say not simply hurtful things about you, but deeply hurtful things about your family. And when that happens, the absolutely natural response is to be discouraged. So what do? Well, the solution to that, what we've got to do, if we're not going to be beaten by this, is to do something that's a lot easier to say. It's a lot easier for me to talk about than it is to do, but it's very simple. You got to ignore it. You got to ignore it. You got to pay no attention to it. You got to recognize there are going to be some people that are pleased with what you do and some people that are going to be infuriated by what you do, but ultimately you don't answer to any of them. You answer to the Lord. And ultimately, every single believer, every person that has a walk with God, ultimately has an audience to their life of one, and that's the Lord Himself. So when that happens, when discouragement begins to set in, and naysayers begin to chant, and they begin to murmur, and they begin to whine and moan and complain, you got to tell yourself, I can't listen to that. I'm not going to listen to that. When I was in seminary, I had to take a couple of preaching classes, and hearing that, I know you're thinking, taking? Why weren't you teaching? I understand. Anyway, so I had to take a couple of preaching classes. One was a sermon prep class, and then that was followed by another semester of sermon delivery. In the sermon delivery class, one of the requirements was that in class, throughout the course of the semester, every student in that class would have to preach 3 sermons. And they would do so before the professor and before all their peers in that class. And hopefully you can already begin to tell that's a nerve-wracking experience. And it was so for a variety of reasons. First of all, you couldn't preach a normal length sermon. The sermons had to be no more than 10 minutes. You're like, yes. I know you're thinking, clearly I failed that part of the class, but at least in the class, though, these sermons could be no more than 10 minutes. You got to 10 minutes and 1 second, the professor's cutting you off. And if you didn't do a complete sermon within that 10-minute time frame, your grade was going to be appropriately reflective of that fact. All right, so it has to be a 10-minute sermon. Secondly, you can use no notes whatsoever. And so everything that you say, you better have it up in your mind and in your heart, because that's all you're going to be able to go into that pulpit with is your Bible. And so there's that to make things more difficult. In addition, you're preaching in front of your peers and guys that are going to be out and already are in the process of doing this before congregations already. And as if that's not bad enough, you're doing this in front of your professor. My preaching professor, it is his job to teach preaching. He knows how to preach. And as if all that's not bad enough, both he and all the students in the class are sitting there with a grading sheet. And on that grading sheet is the same on each page for every student in the class. There's a series of criteria. And as you are preaching, everybody's sitting there with a pen, with a pencil. They're not taking notes. They are grading you based on these various criteria. Oh, you got a 2 on that. Oh, that was good. How about an 8? And they're making all these comments. It is absolutely and was a terribly nerve-wracking experience. And so in advance of these messages, what I would do, and I'm sure everybody in the class did, you had to practice these things. You had to, first of all, know that you could preach this sermon and do so from memory. You also had to be able to do so within 10 minutes time span. And so what I would do is in my little one-bedroom apartment, I'd go in the bedroom, I'd stand in front of the mirror, I'd look at my watch, and I would start preaching, just me all by myself, preaching to myself in front of the mirror there in my apartment. As I would do so, nobody is there. No one is listening to me. My heart would begin to race. My palms would get sweaty. Nobody is there, and I'm already nervous. And so in advance of preaching before these classes, I'm thinking to myself, how in the world am I going to do this? How in the world am I going to be able to do this? But finally, I was able to do so. And do you know how I did so? Well, it's because I had a little conversation with myself, reminding myself of a simple reality. Yes, these sermons are part of the requirement for this class, and I'm going to get a grade on this. But when push comes to shove, what I am doing is teaching people the Word of God. And ultimately, my responsibility in doing that is to do so in a way that pleases God, whether they like it or not. So then I thought, well, that I can do. Now, that type of thinking is tough when the circumstances are tough. When the situation is stressful, when there's the presence of opposition, it's tough to remind yourself that you have an audience ultimately of one. What happens, though, is that when we're on our own personal griddle and the opposition and the naysayers begin to talk, what happens is that discouragement begins to set in, and as it does so, our gaze, our attention starts coming lower and lower and lower and lower, and we're focusing on where the discouragement is coming from. We start paying attention to those people, and we start asking ourselves, well, what can I do to get them off my back? What can I do that will actually please them? What can I do that might get them to say something actually positive about me? But if you live your life and render your service to God with the intent on pleasing others, not only are you going to be disappointed, you're going to wind up losing any fizz that you have. The life, the vitality, the zeal, the passion, it is all going to go away, and you're going to be overwhelmed with discouragement. Listen, what we've got to do is to remind ourselves and live in such a way that we're aware of this fact. We are never, ever going to please everybody. But we can live in such a way as to please God. And that's all that matters. Trying to live any other way is going to get you discouraged. And as you get discouraged, increasingly your attention, your focus is going to go from being heavenward to focusing on everybody else, what the naysayers are saying. And that's how discouragement works. It leads you to focus on the attention of others, but it also leads to something else. It will lead you to forget what God has done. So, after hearing these threats from Jezebel, and these weren't just threats, again, this is effectively a death warrant, Elijah does something. It says, verse 3, he arose, he ran for his life, he goes to Beersheba, leaves his servant there, and then travels a day's journey out in the wilderness. And we find him in verse 4, and he's sitting under the broom tree, or the juniper tree, and he is saying, okay, God, let's get this over with. Go ahead and kill me. It's over with. Curtains. Verse 3, though, there's something that's said there it's easy to pass over this little statement, but it's noteworthy. He begins by leaving town. He's running for his life. Then it says he goes to Beersheba. So that's the first town he arrives at. Then it says he leaves his servant there. He leaves his servant there. Why did he do that? Why did he leave his servant there? Well, verse 4, I think, gives us the answer, where he says at the end of that, it's enough now, Lord, take my life. He leaves his servant there because he thinks my life, my ministry, everything now is over. There's nothing more to do. God is through with us. The consequences of serving God now are no longer positive. The risks are great. The costs are high. The sacrifice is overwhelming. God clearly is through with us. So you go find something else to do. I'm going to head out here so that I can die and God can go ahead and call me home. Now, I recognize it is easy for us looking back to reflect on what goes on and to say what could have, should have, ought to have happened because we've got the lens of thousands of years of history to look through. We've got the full account and record of God's Word. And so that being said, I don't want to beat unjustly on Elijah. That being said, though he is in many ways a great hero of the Old Testament, he's not a perfect man and he didn't have a perfect walk with God. And here I would suggest to you we find an episode of him failing and falling before God. So with all that as a prelude, I would say this. I wish Elijah would have said something else to God other than that. I wish he would have done something and prayed to God a different prayer. Instead of saying, God, okay, kill me, go ahead and take my life. Instead of doing that, I wish he would have said, God, I'm pretty scared right now. This old battle axe, Jezebel, is after me. She's got her soldiers looking for me. She's sworn to kill me. And I'll be honest with you, God, you know this already. I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how things are going to turn out. But you know what? God, I remember some of the stuff that you did. I remember back at the widow's house, you caused her oil not to run out. I remember when her son died, you had me lay across his lifeless body and pray, and I saw a dead boy live again. I saw you stop the rain, not a cloud in the sky, for weeks on end. I saw you demonstrate your power there on Mount Carmel. It was just me against 450 prophets of Baal. You consumed the sacrifice and lapped up all the water. As it relates to water, God, I remember too seeing you turn the spigot back on and the rains came. God, I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know of your power and your faithfulness in the past, so I'm trusting you whatever happens in the present. Now, if we were to write how it would unfold, that's how we would hope that it would unfold, but it didn't. Elijah doesn't do any of that. Why? Because he's discouraged, and discouragement has got his attention, his focus off God, and it's gotten on, first of all, other people, on Ahab and on Jezebel. And not only has he gotten his focus and his attention on them, it seems as though he's gotten amnesia and forgotten everything that God has done. He's forgotten about the repeated instances where he has had a front row seat to amazing, phenomenal, Bible-worthy miracles. It seems as though he has forgotten about all of that. He's forgotten what God has done. Really, this is a case study in discouragement for us because it works the same way in our lives. Regardless of how long you have walked with God, when you begin to get discouraged and your focus leaves God and begins to get on others, As it begins to do its work in your life, you're going to feel like there's this heavy cloud hanging over your life and your heart. And you begin to so focus not only on others, but on the challenges, the costs, the trials, the travails of what's going on now, that somehow in the process you forget about everything that God has done in the past. John Sargent is a name that you're probably not familiar with, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he was a pretty renowned artist, especially known and notable for his portrait painting. In fact, two of his paintings hang today in the White House. The portrait of Theodore Roosevelt and the portrait of Woodrow Wilson hang today in the White House, portraits that John Sargent painted. Early in his artistic career, though, he painted a panel of roses that once people began to see it, it got wide critical acclaim in the art community, and people were just amazed by this. It was described as being, quote, nearing perfection. It was a beautiful, beautiful painting. And because it was so beautiful and because it had such acclaim and there was so much buzz about this, there were many people who sought to purchase this painting that Sargent had made. But though he had had countless offers for it, every single time he refused. And once he was asked, "Why is it that you will not sell that painting?" And his response was this: "At some point along the way, my work will be criticized. Discouragement will set in, and I will doubt my abilities as an artist. But I will always have this to look back on and say, I painted that." Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that you need great memories of great things that you have done. What I am suggesting, and more than suggesting, what I'm telling you is that you do need in your mind and etched in your heart memories of great things that God has done. You need memories that you have made with God through difficult circumstances and going through loss, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, the loss of health, the loss of feelings of personal security. You need to have memories of how God got you through those seasons of time. You need to have memories made with God when they were mountaintop experiences, when opposition wasn't experienced, but God was doing great and significant things in your life. You need memories of what not only God saved you from, but what He prevented you from experiencing. You need those memories. Beyond that, you need memories of what you have been able to see God do in the lives of those around you, whether it was somebody at church or a story that you read of someone in the past of how God had worked in their life. You need those memories. They need to be here because discouragement is going to come, and when it comes, you're going to begin so easily to forget about what God has done in the past. Listen, God wants us to have those memories, not so that we can sit back on our laurels and sing precious memories, how they linger. Rather, He wants us to have those memories so that we can say this: I know of your power and I know of your faithfulness in the past. Because of that, I can trust you right now. But discouragement prevents that. It leads you to have amnesia. You just kind of forget everything that God has done. Listen, if it could happen to somebody else like Elijah, why couldn't it happen to you? Why might it not have already been and is happening to you? But that's how discouragement works. Well, we see a final way that this works in our lives in the passage, which is in this way. It'll lead you to feel things are as they are not. It will lead you to feel things are as they are not. So, we left him in verse 4. He is ready to die. He's saying, God, kill me. But he goes to sleep in verse 5. And as he goes to sleep, an angel shows up and cooks supper for him. And pokes him on the shoulder and says, hey, get up, eat. So there's a cake baked on coals. I'd like to think it was chocolate. There's a cake baked on coals. There's a jar of water. He eats what the angel has prepared for him. And then the angel of the Lord came back a second time, touched him again, says, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. So he has two significantly large meals. And he needs those because starting in verse 8, he's going to get up and God leads him for 40 days and nights. He's not having anything apparently to eat along the way until finally he gets to Mount Horeb. Now, once he gets to Mount Horeb, he goes into a cave. It says he spends the night in that place. And the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Elijah, what are you doing here? Well, Elijah's thinking, well, what I'm doing here, I figured this is when your galactic hearse is going to come get me. Because I've been saying already 40 days ago, I said, God, go ahead and kill me, because if you don't go ahead and take me, well, Jezebel's going to take me out of this world, so I wish you'd just go ahead and do it. Clearly, everything is over with. My ministry's gone. Everything is in ruins. What are you doing here? Well, Elijah responds to God's question in verse 10, and he gets a little indignant with God. Lord, I have been very zealous for you. I've been zealous for the children of Israel, even though they have forsaken your covenants. They have been living as though they don't even know who you are. They've torn down your altars. They've put up altars to Baal. They've killed your prophets with the sword. And now it's me. I alone am left. Discouragement led Elijah to that realization. Here's the question. Was that realization correct? It was not. Though we didn't read what happens, if you were to continue in the verses that follow, you get the rest of the story. So Elijah, in verse 11, is out on the mountain, and God tells him, go stand out where you can see. And it says, the Lord passed by, and there was this great strong wind that tore into the mountains, broke rocks into pieces. So this massive gale force wind. Then there was an earthquake, and after the earthquake there was a fire, but the voice of God was not in any of those things. Finally, we're told in verse 12, there was a voice heard, but it was a still small voice. And the silence, the solitude of that place there on the mountain, God speaks. And after seeing all of this, Elijah says in verse 14 the same thing he said back in verse 10. I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. The children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left. Me, myself, and I. Discouraged, despondent. And God responds in verse 15. He says, get up on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you're there, he's telling him to anoint another man as king. Verse 18, though, is noteworthy. God says this, yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. All right, so Elijah is at this point. He's saying, God, will you just kill me? Life, ministry, everything is over with. This hag named Jezebel is after me, so it's curtains. So go ahead and take me to heaven. I'm discouraged. I'm despondent. It's all over with. God, you're through with me. There's nothing more now that can be done. Let's get it over with. It's just down to me. That was his perception. But was that reality? God's saying it's emphatically not reality. But Elijah came to that point because discouragement was at work, and discouragement will lead you to think things are as they are not. There was a couple who rented a little cottage to have a week's vacation together, just the two of them there. One afternoon, everything's kind of quiet. They've just been taking it easy throughout the course of the week. The wife is in the kitchen. She's washing some dishes there at the sink. The husband is just lounging around on the couch in the den. And after laying there for a little bit, he gets up and he looks out the window. And looking out the window, he sees a swimming pool. He calls out to his wife, who's standing at the kitchen washing dishes. He says to her, hey, honey, it's beautiful outside. Why don't we change our clothes and go out and get some exercise? Because through his window, he sees the swimming pool. Well, his wife, standing there at the kitchen sink, looks out the window. Hearing what her husband says, she looks out and she sees the tennis courts. And she says to her husband, I think that's a great idea. So they both go and change. She comes out dressed for a tennis match. He comes out with his swim trunks on. Why? Because the window that you choose to look through will determine your perception of reality. The window that you look through will determine your perception of reality. What I'm saying to you is that discouragement will lead you to look out the wrong window. It will lead you to so focus on your circumstances and yourself that you fail to see the big picture, to see things as they are. Notice, Elijah says the same thing in verse 10 that he says in verse 14. Notice the personal pronouns in that verse. He starts with at the beginning of the verse by saying, I have been very zealous. Then he ends that same statement by saying, I alone and left, and they seek to take my life. My. Through what lens, through what window is Elijah looking through? At this point, everything's about himself. And you've seen this progression. It's gone from focusing on God to focusing on others, forgetting what God has done, and finally it gets to a very small world where all you see is yourself and your circumstances. And when that happens, discouragement will rob any fizz, any life, any vitality that's present. So God comes to him and says, that's not how things are. I am not dead and you are not alone. Just in Israel there are 7,000 who have yet to bow the knee to Baal. Get up. I'm not done with you yet. Discouragement nearly cost Elijah the ability to finish his ministry strong. He was ready to give up, give in, and throw in the towel. But God still had plans for Elijah, plans that could never be experienced, never realized until discouragement had been beaten. Listen, God in His providence has decided to use ordinary people, not only like Elijah, but ordinary people like you and me to accomplish His work. He does not need an army of quitters. What He doesn't need are those that are focused on themselves, on the attention of others, or on the trials of their circumstances. What He needs are people that say, you know what, it's tough, but I'm going to keep my focus on Him. My question for you this morning is this: if you feel like the fizz is gone, and if discouragement has been the thief that has robbed you of that life and vitality, where has your focus been? Let me follow that up with a second question. When you leave this place today, where will your focus be? Won't you bow your heads with me?